Welcome to Adopting Zero Trust, an independent podcast that dives into the world of zero trust and tells the story of people who are adopting it. Throughout our series, we'll investigate why zero trust is becoming a critical concept for cybersecurity. Our hosts, Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis, will have transparent and open conversations with the people driving modern security approaches forward, while leaving vendor hype behind. It's time to remove implicit trust and buzzwords and get to the root of the movement.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another episode of AZT or Adopting Zero Trust. I'm your producer, Elliot Volkman, alongside our currently munching on I don't know what, something terrible at the airport, Neil Dennis, alongside our wonderful guest, Janet, who will, in just a moment, introduce herself. So, as with our typical format, we do have a theme in mind, and this is going to be one of those really excellent episodes that Neil and I have honestly just been waiting to lock in with you all. Zero trust as a concept, maybe like a philosophy, it definitely aligns with this idea that prevention has more impact than being in this reactive state where, as things arise, you're knocking them out. The idea is you're supposed to get ahead of those threats. So we have an expert who works at an organization of a significant size, to say the least. But with that being said, Janet, I figure maybe we'll just hand it off to you instead of me just trying to read off your LinkedIn resume, so to speak.
Of course.
Maybe we can chat about where you're at and what led you to where you are today.
Yeah, so I'm currently the CISO at iHeartMedia, and I've been here almost 3 years now, and I've been in the CISO role for over almost maybe a dozen years at various companies, different industries, and I'm kind of gravitate towards learning new industries. So that's and how they operate and how security is the same or different at the different companies I've worked at.
Very cool. And I know that you've also worked at some pretty large organizations, not just at iHeartRadio. So you're no stranger to handling these at just magnanimous levels. Plus, I suspect since you work at where you work, you're probably tolerant of people like Neil and myself being a little more obnoxious and goofy on this. So fortunately, we're not very structured. So I appreciate you coming on and bearing with us as Neil's in the airport. So we'll see how that all turns out. It's new for us, new territory. That all said, I just want to look a little bit more into your background. Obviously, you didn't wake up one day and become CISO, a giant organization. There was a pathway that kind of led you towards that. Some people stick towards being in the weeds and practitioner, being strategy, being intel. You're kind of the combination of everything, including that business element that organizations absolutely need, that top-down person that can speak towards these different elements. So I'd love to know what led you towards that business perspective of cybersecurity.
Sure. Yeah. I mean, it's something that I've always gravitated towards as far as I call it bridging the gap between IT talk and non-IT talk, and being able to really translate business needs into technology processes or solutions. And that's something that I've kind of always had I guess I call it a knack for. And I've started out in IT, early in my career as a programmer, moved into, leadership management roles. And I got into a role when I worked at Merck, pharmaceutical company, leading an organization they called it e-learning. So that was when learning was, used to be in classroom, and then we moved it all to being able to do synchronous or asynchronous online learning. And I moved in that same company, I moved from e-learning into e-discovery, which is the collection and preservation of data in preparation for legal matters, right? And that was, as a pharmaceutical company, obviously they have some legal matters, as any pharmaceutical company does. And so that was a pretty big organization. And that kind of folded me into the then leader of security at Merck. And I got exposed to a lot of my peers and what they were doing in security. And a lot of it was like the information lifecycle, right? It's the things we were doing in e-discovery where we were capturing data and preserving data, but we had all this data that maybe, we didn't need to have because people aren't good at throwing away data. And it kind of led into that whole, my interest and desire to get into security. And now I kind of call it like I'm in e-security, right? Because I've been e-learning and e-discovery and now e-security.
Very cool. Yeah, that's like a very interesting journey. I feel like a lot of the people that we may have chatted with are not necessarily on the in the weeds programming perspective. Maybe Neil kind of aligns more towards that world, but Yeah, it's very cool to see that perspective. But let's shift over towards the elephant in the room, which is being able to, I guess, secure an organization with, I think it is at least 11,000 employees. I can only imagine the physical footprint and the digital footprint that gets involved, but maybe you can give us a little bit of perspective to help us conceptualize just how vast the amount of information and people that you have to secure is in your role.
Yeah, I mean, I can give you some background on iHeart as a company, just because I think people know the app, the iHeartRadio app. I think that's like everyone connects to that when I say iHeart, and they call the company iHeartRadio, even though the company's iHeartMedia. So it's that's obviously what they relate to, right? Is the app, and we have the largest number of downloads and streams on the app for compared to any of our peers. We do so. That's kind of our digital side. The live streaming of live stations and podcasts and all that. And then we have the radio side. And in the US, we have about 860 radio stations across the country in what we call 160 US markets. So if you pick like Miami, that's a market. They have 5 or 6 radio stations there. And all the cities that, so you do the multiplication, right, of 160 times 5 or 6 radio stations, a little more in some. So you get 860 radio stations, live broadcast. And then we do events. So we just did the iHeart Country Festival here in Austin, in San Antonio. So Austin's right up the road. We do the annual iHeart Music Festival, iHeart Radio Music Festival, which is a 2-day event in Las Vegas, and all sorts of, I think we do like 20,000 events annually. So just kind of giving you the perspective of, all the different things we do as a company.
Yeah, that is quite a footprint to say that you need to cover just absolutely everything. So, I mean, well, I hope you don't mind me asking this, but obviously that probably comes with quite a bit of pressure then.
Yeah, I mean, there's definitely, one of the other things that I didn't mention is because we're in radio, we're actually, part of the emergency broadcast system. So that's another just, added, you called it pressure, right? Another area.
Just a little bit.
Yeah. But there are things that are, I'd say, common across the different industries companies that I worked at in different industries. I think a lot of it is, you were talking about the proactive nature. And I always said, if I could build an IT organization from the ground up, right, and then you could build security in by design, right? So you have security by design, especially as a security practitioner, that would be a priority for me, right? As I built, had the opportunity to build an IT organization, brand new company, kind of greenfield thing. It's my, my fantasy, my dream to be able to do that. But we all have legacy. Every company has legacy. Every company has systems that have to be up all the time, whether that's back when I was in biotech and we had, we were actually, they're biological products that grow. And so you can't turn anything off because they're actually growing and living organisms, all the way to, the cruise ships that have to be, out at sea all the time. There's always something you can't turn off. And so I think there's some common challenges. And then I think each company in the different industries has their own kind of unique challenges when it comes to to moving to a more proactive state.
Yeah, and I think you nailed the matter on the head. Where I was kind of going with this is that, I could only imagine, so being in your shoes is probably pretty stressful, but that means a reactive state is never going to be, a spot that you want to be in. So prevention is, probably that most critical aspect. I assume as a business leader, that's just the nature of the beast, that you have to find ways to constantly get ahead of threats, any kind of issues, not even just necessarily on the cybersecurity side. But yeah, I think that just kind of pivots very well into the theme at hand, which is prevention. But I'd love to just know maybe your philosophy between, prevention as it relates to cybersecurity or just in general. Maybe I'm off base and making too many assumptions there, but I'd love to just know your perspective on the role prevention plays.
Yeah, I mean, I think the first thing I like to make sure happens, or the company that I, work for has in place, is really strong detection and response, right? So if you look at, the NIST cybersecurity framework, right, the detection and response components, I think you have to have in place. They have to be your most mature functions, because everybody's going to get hit with something, and being able to detect it early and respond quickly. Those are your two, the best way you could be ready. I wouldn't say proactive, but ready, right? And then the prevention piece, which, prevent is also one of the 5 NIST categories. That is, I think it's like almost like a never-ending investment opportunity when it comes to what you can do to prevent bad things from happening in a couple ways, right? And it's not just in tools, right? It's in people, and you can call the people, divide the people up into the people you need to hire on your security team and the awareness that you need to give your employees in an organization so that they can help you prevent bad things from happening. And then, looking around at all the different aspects of IT, from your application development, where you are in the cloud, what your network looks like. There's just so many different opportunities to have visibility into what's happening there. And there's a tool for everything in security right now, right? There's lots of tools. So it's balancing, what your priorities, what you have to have versus the maybe, you can get this some other way, or you don't, down to the bottom, kind of like you can push that off a little bit. Because you could spend, all of the security dollars and probably all of IT dollars investing in security tools if for prevention. I mean, there's just so much out there.
Yeah, that absolutely makes sense. And in fact, I'm going to hand this over to Neil, because this is a conversation that I think we've had for the last 3 episodes. There's that common theme of, yeah, absolutely spot on. There is a tool for everything, and now there's probably a tool for a few too many things. But Neil, let's get you to add some color into this conversation of the consolidation.
I have a couple of curiosity questions, actually, maybe to preface this with. So given that you are a media conglomerate, right? You mentioned the market spaces and the scope of what that is. I imagine nowadays in the digital world, a lot of this is probably being recorded more like what we're doing today in a sense, right? And then broadcasted out maybe through some kind of digital gateway, then up through the antenna, all this other fun stuff. Aside from all that fun stuff that goes on to actually get the signals out to everybody, I think that to me seems kind of fun to think about from a unique situation where you blatantly have to have an open, at least one way, for both a digital consumption path on the internet as well as to the phone platforms and the apps. So that's a whole nother thing, AppSec versus web AppSec, as well as all the tools that go into making that a reality, right? So normal companies, even at Merck, yes, they've got gateways for updates for tools and things like that, but those are very focused things. You've got a literal nationwide gateway thing. I'm sure there's some things y'all have done maybe to focus on that. But all that to say, I'm just intrinsically curious about that footprint and how you've kind of considered that footprint, or if that's even something that's even worth considering nowadays. Have you all been able to consolidate these endpoints and these footprints down to a manageable aspect as you build this preventative mentality around things?
So there's a couple different technologies involved so radio broadcasts, right, is different than the iHeartRadio app, for example, right? And so the radio broadcast, transmits from the radio station to the towers out to the radio waves, right, to the transmission waves. And I consider that to be the operational technology side, the OT side of the business, if you will. Every company I work for has the OT. And what I say is it's not as interesting or susceptible in some ways that as other apps might be, other things that might be like apps. And then we have the iHeartRadio app, which is available, in a lot of different technology platforms. And so that's an app that we obviously want to ensure is secure, and because it is, out there as it is as our regular website, our iHeartRadio website, where you can sign in and listen to podcasts and radio as well. So they're kind of two different animals, if you will. And I think that the radio app is probably much more visible.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So I used to work in the OT side of the house, so I'm always just kind of intrinsically curious about the blending of OT and IT aspects of things, because we've come such a long way with this, right? And even 10 years ago, if you talk to someone who was setting up any kind of OT network and they saw a Cat5 cable on the back of it, the first curiosity point was to find a Cat5 cable, plug it in, and then forget to remove it. And then realize that it was plugged into something it shouldn't have been for however long it was, right? And that was only 10, 15 years ago. So I always find it very interesting to think about security where we finally got into a more blended architecture where people understand OT and IT and playing together. And now obviously we have IoT as a mainstream construct, right? Yeah. So that's awesome. So from security perspective and moving this forward, like Elliot mentioned, there's a lot of tech stacks out there. There's a lot of growth that people went over the last couple of years, courtesy of COVID. And in your case, like you mentioned earlier on, there's a lot of legacy hardware that you just already intrinsically have. Probably some of it because of how the OT systems work, I imagine. Some of it because of different iterations around, web app and app security, mobile app security, stuff like that. How are y'all approaching kind of the potential consolidation aspect? How are y'all looking at this larger tech stack that you've likely adopted over the last few years more so than anything, and trying to think about, approaching that, either securing it or maybe whittling away at it as part of the security process? Kind of what are your thoughts around those process flows for that?
Yeah, and I think when you go back a few years and you think of OT, the folks that traditionally have run that, right, whatever industry you're in, there's that group of people that are, whether they're engineers, technicians, whatever, right, maybe weren't part of IT, and they tend to be, for all the right reasons, protective of their systems, right? And so including them into trying out some of the new tools that are out there that actually, they can protect my laptop and they can protect your OT server as well, right? So getting over that barrier, if you will, of, we can install endpoint protection on your OT device. It won't bring it down, it won't shut it down. It won't cause all this, all these problems, and just really working together as part of a team to start to make inroads into that. That's what I found to be the most helpful, and actually, kind of helps with the momentum as well. And you're right, you do uncover things, and this is kind of a broad statement wherever I've worked, right? You do uncover things that, aren't compatible, aren't going to work with whatever you're trying to do to secure it. And you have to come up with depending on what it is, you might have to come up with a workaround or some other mitigation that gives you visibility into what's happening, but doesn't necessarily end up with you installing something on it. Just because, there's legacy and then there's legacy, right? just doesn't operate the same way.
No worries. That's very true. I still break things that I'm not supposed to break when I go on site with certain clients, but that's a different thing. That being said, I think echoing this a little bit, communication is obviously always key, right? There's I think the OT side of the house, no matter where they're at in this journey, they're always the most protective of their infrastructure, period, than any other engineer on the IT side will ever be. And so I think that's awesome. Just have an open comms line with them, let them know that you're not here to destroy them. You're here to hopefully keep them from getting destroyed, and then see if you can get them to tag along with the new toys. So on that note, though, are y'all, from a tech stack perspective, are y'all looking at or already or planning to leverage any kind of like intrinsic automation beyond just the security team itself? Because I know we've got SOAR that's been around for a while, but there's kind of some fun trends courtesy of this tech boom. Growth, or tech purchase boom rather. There's been some decent trends, I think, with people finally getting on board with automation beyond incident response. Is that something that y'all are starting to maybe consider, already have, for helping with some of this more preventative structure flow?
The team likes to stay abreast of everything that's going on, and one of the characteristics I look for in my teammates is curiosity and learning, right? And so we are constantly looking at what the future trends are and building that into our roadmap where it makes sense. There's some concerns. I wouldn't say I have concerns, but I have maybe proceed with caution about automation. And why I say that is because depending on what the automation can do for us, it can also undo some stuff, right? So what I mean by that is it can, we build up a very strong partnership with IT and with our OT team, and also just the business in general, and you can really flush that down the toilet in one error in automation, right? And so we want to proceed with caution with that, but definitely want to take advantage of it where it makes sense.
Awesome. So I think from a thematics perspective, when we start thinking about action items, both preventative and reactive. So I'm as an Intel analyst, I'm always pushing people to be more proactive in their efforts, both on the SOC side and everything else, right? So one of the big things I harp on is more of a intrinsic value of what Intel brings to a company as a whole, not just a SOC. That's kind of why I kind of go down the rabbit hole with the automation piece a little bit. But I think you're kind of also echoing my sentiment here, just in general, with what I can bring to the table as a whole from an Intel perspective is what I think most orgs are trying to get to is just that communications bridge, period, right? Finding
Right.
pathways to have that good conversation. And I think prospectively, if, like you alluded to a few seconds ago, if you've got the right people chatting about anything, really, the right conversation is going to probably happen to get things moving forward, right?
Yes. And I think most people want to, be more secure for sure, regardless of their role and where they sit in the organization. Some of it's just, understanding the impact, knowing how they can help, and making sure. I think the real important thing is building that trust and understanding that I know what it is that's important to you, right? It's not like security, security, security. Let's just go hammer it in everywhere, right? It's got to be in partnership and have joint and aligned goals to make it happen.
I think we've kind of hit the jackpot, Elliot, the last couple of weeks. We've had two wonderful personas here in the C-suite level here that have both very, very upfront and very blunt said, we need to talk. We got to have communications. If we don't, then why are we even doing the job, basically? We're not going to get enough stuff done. I think this is awesome. I think this is also a growth over the last 10, 15 years where most C-suite people were, they would talk, obviously, to themselves, but then there wasn't a lot of conversation downstream, or there wasn't a lot of involvement. And I think that's kind of neat to see. And you talk about, you've got curious people on your team that are looking at new things. You know that the people are talking with one another. And those are not conversations I would have had with my C-suite, I don't know, maybe right before COVID. It would have been more like, oh, you're Neil. Hi, I don't know who you are. I'm the manager of your Intel department. And he's like, yeah, I don't know what that is. So no, I think this is awesome. It's good stuff. So on the preventative perspectives, from a zero trust mentality, and you look at your larger your larger architecture that you're personally dealing with, how far down the hole have y'all gone from the zero trust mentality, from like access controls, and whether for the tooling or for the personnel, and how important is it for you to see that kind of wrap up as part of that preventative mentality to make sure that, limited exposure, limited access, especially, web app and all that other fun stuff that you have to manage?
Yeah, and I think the wording that you used makes a lot of sense, right? It's talking about that preventative positioning versus I can't get very far into my organization talking about zero trust, right? Because it's a great term and we all understand what it means, but it's really just preventing openings that don't need to exist, right? That's what you're trying to do. Is you're trying to we used to make everything easier for everybody, but now that's also easier for the bad guys. So when we've got to kind of close, I always say it's like we close the front door, but the back window's open, right? So your bad guy's going to crawl in the back window. So yeah, that's the analogy. One of the analogies I use to kind of help describe what that preventative position is that you want to be in, right? Yeah, I mean, I think companies in general are, the security organizations within companies in general are all heading down this zero trust path in some way, shape, or form. I think it varies depending on the company's priorities. Quite frankly, the economy that we're in right now is a little challenging for everybody. And so things may have, companies may have slowed down a little bit. But I think, the days of, do we have multi-factor authentication? Like some of the stuff is just table stakes and you're expected to have it, especially if you've ever been through getting cybersecurity insurance. That's always a fun endeavor. And it's changed with just the insurers have changed over the past, I'd say 5 or so years, right? Now that they've had to make some payouts and they're asking tougher questions. So kind of circling back, I think everybody's on that journey. And it's just a matter of whether you're a government agency, a financial institution, healthcare, right? Pick all these different industries that probably have, they're regulated or they're very interesting to the bad guys.
No, that makes a lot of sense. Thank you. No, I was just kind of very curious about the blending from the blending of technologies, right? And then having this large potentially global footprint, because I know for a fact when I went overseas, I was listening to iHeart. But this larger global footprint combined with the traditional aspects of what you're doing, what that's done from like prioritization of how y'all have approached the security structure in a sense, like what have y'all maybe prioritized over other things in a sense of high level, identity access management from a personal perspective, web app security from a XYZ like engineering perspective, or just that general kind of aspect of that large footprint that you really do have.
Yeah, I mean, I think again, it's probably not uncommon just for us, but the cloud has definitely grown immensely in the past. I'm going to pick a number, maybe 4 years. I've seen exponentially. Just again, peer companies, colleagues that that work at different companies. It's just the way companies are going, right? And I think that cloud security, I think, is really a number one priority for a lot of organizations, because they may have gone cloud first and security last. It's kind of like I say that jokingly, but maybe not so jokingly. And again, seeing that just from what's been done, organizations I've been in the past as well. It's an area that I don't think the cloud providers really did I wouldn't say they did a disservice, but they maybe didn't do as good of a service as they could have done when it came to, hey, bring all your workloads over to the cloud. Everything will be great. It'll be cheaper. It'll be more secure. It'll be this. It'll be that. Right. Well, I'm not sure what there has actually held true.
I like that. I think we just talked with someone a little bit more about cloud security ownership and who really should be responsible. In some layers, pick your flavor of cloud, but some of those layers, they provide an elevated service, but it's obviously at a premium, and it's a very limited amount of people who go all the way through with that premium offering. I do know from personal exposure that at a base level that there's a decent amount of things that go on through, like the Cloud Security Alliance and a few other organizations, but they're not worried about your open server. They're not worried about making sure that you have a secure password or lock this down or have MFA or whatever else it is, right? All they care about is way up here if someone very bad is doing very bad things, or way down at the very, very bottom if someone's trying to take out some very minor things that tends to be trending. They don't care about the middle road stuff too much, just because of various reasons. Won't go into that. But I think that's kind of an intriguing question. Do you see yourself now with the cloud security side, and I think this is once again another generic kind of trends piece here, do you see the trend leaning more towards pushing the AWS's, Googles, and Azures of the world to be more intrinsically involved with the larger security component outside of the additional expensive services that they sometimes offer? Do you see that kind of push to make them be a little more supportive of just making sure things aren't intrinsically just broken by proxy?
I have not. I mean, I do know that they offer their own kind of tooling for security, right? They're kind of native tool sets that come with, to your point, pick the cloud, whichever cloud service provider you're talking about. They do offer tools. I think that they could they could offer more, I guess is what I would say, but the responsibility is clearly on the customer, right? And that's the point that I don't think everybody got when they decided, when companies decide to go to the cloud. I don't think that's something that's thought of. That's kind of goes back to I wish I could build an IT organization from scratch, right? Because there'd be so many places that you couldn't do that without this piece of security. You can do that without this other piece of security. It's just, you need to have them coupled together. And so what we're faced with is, for security professionals, is kind of backpedaling and trying to catch up. They're running ahead in the cloud and we're trying to catch up to them, right? And we're finding along the way, we get stopped with all these we got this thing over here. We got credentials over there. We got this, S3 bucket open. So we're kind of getting derailed as we're trying to catch up to them. So it's kind of like a parallel path that we're on, which is how do we repair, fix, change what's already happening in the cloud? And then we stop it from continuing to happen as companies go deeper and deeper into the cloud.
Oh, so you hit on another fun one. So do you find that you're faced with a lot of potentially net new, rogue IT things going on? I know, once again, pre-cloud or pre-official push in the cloud, you had an IT department and they took care of everything, from the respectful of, deployment and the actual operationalizational, the O word of things. So, IT used to build things, manage things, maybe help secure things, but more or less they were there. They knew what was readily accessible. And now, courtesy of cloud, courtesy of COVID, do you find yourself battling a constant fight of, wow, I didn't know we bought this. Wow, I didn't know we put things in GitHub yesterday with this new GitHub server, or whatever, stuff to that effect?
Yeah, I mean, I think what helps with that is again, the employee side of it, right? The people side of it is really having a good awareness. I call it campaign, but it's really communication about why you should or shouldn't do things. Getting embedded in the procurement process I call it follow the money, right? Who are we paying? And then follow that back to what are we paying them for? And, who in the company is, engaged with them to pay them in the first place. That certainly helps. Getting, again, if you've got less people kind of going out on their own doing these things, certainly the one thing I would mention is SaaS, right? The SaaS has really made it, you show up with your credit card, you're good to go. And I think that it really gets down to the process and the awareness of to being able to kind of nip that in the bud, if you will, right? And again, it's visibility, right? So if you can see and there's tools for that. If you can see where your employees are going, you can get really good visibility into what sites they're going to, what SaaS apps they're going to, what kind of sites they are, what kind of apps they are, and then kind of understand exactly what the business purpose is or not. And then prioritize from there, would it have a big impact, or is it really, low impact on the company potentially? Right? Because you don't know.
Yeah, I think that's awesome, because I do honestly feel like that's something that a lot of leadership forgets nowadays, is that they need to be actively engaged in trying to find those potential rogue assets. Not assets, but rogue toolings or procurements, especially in the SaaS world. And so I think that's, to your point, it's important to have a process flow to identify that and have that conversation one way or another. And on that same vein, are y'all faced with a mix of remote and on-prem staff nowadays? Do you have like a recording studio in someone's basement that you have to worry about just as much as you do a corporate studio kind of thing as well? Is that part of y'all's?
Yeah, we have
concern?
A mix. I mean, when COVID hit, certainly we went remote and still broadcast live, and some talent prefers to be in the studio in the office, and some talent, can do it remotely. But that was certainly just having a remote workforce in general, right, is a switching from a full in-office, workforce to a remote workforce, regardless of what business you're in, was, super challenging during COVID. I was still at Royal Caribbean at the time when COVID hit, and we all kind of went home that March in 2020. Yeah, there's so many factors that go into it that are including security, and then even beyond that.
So out of curiosity, what would you consider maybe a key starting place when we start moving down the preventative piece? Where would you suggest people maybe start their looks into building into that more proactive effort?
Yeah, I mean, I think it kind of depends on where you are and maturity wise. There's, the big ones are, single sign-on MFA, right? So if you can get SSO and MFA in place, that's super helpful, especially for those what you call rogue apps, right? So people aren't, after they leave the company, we didn't know they even had that app, and then maybe they still have access to it. So that certainly helps from that aspect. And then and again, it depends on your company and your own priorities for your individual industry that you're in. I think visibility into what's going on in your endpoints. And there's a lot of good tools out there for that that doesn't just look for bad files or bad hashes or whatever. They also look at behavior, right? So the computer is operating in a way that it never normally would operate, and having all of that data aggregated into a SIM so that you can make heads or tails of it. Because you don't want your security folks burned out by responding to the false positives, right? So there's a lot of tuning that has to go on, but I think those are kind of the first couple things I would recommend. Because gaining visibility is hard, and by that I mean people don't typically measure or even know how to get metrics to measure how we're doing and how far we've gotten tools implemented, and those kind of things. And I think understanding what your footprint is as a whole, what are all our assets that we actually own, and do I have protection on all of them? And if I don't know what they all are, how can I have protection? How do I know if they're all protected? So I think visibility is definitely, I would call it a foundational step in prevention.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah, I like that one. Once again, 20 years ago doing this stuff, trying to find things before cloud was a pain in the butt. Finding things now with cloud is obviously a bigger pain in the butt. But I feel like there's a lot of cool companies that have come along with, not naming names on them at all, but I feel like there's a lot of decent headway that's been made over the last handful. And I know COVID has definitely skyrocketed this a little bit. But, it used to be good luck, go do a port scan, Nmap, network capture, whatever, and hope that you could figure out what was going on where, right? Maybe just a large dump in Wireshark 15 years ago. Used to run something called NetMonkey and Backtrack back in the day that would do all the protocol captures. but it was never obviously a complete picture. But now I think that discovery phase of what's going on has definitely come a lot further, thankfully.
Yes. Yeah.
I would love on a separate discussion offline, perhaps, or later on, talk with you about your procedures for doing exactly that, because I think that in and of itself is a wonderful, whether it's 10 minutes of, no, I just use this and we're done, or if it's, an hour of, I've done this, we work this way, we've done that. I think that would be an amazing discussion to talk about how you've done just the discovery phase of stuff, planning and all that.
It's definitely a journey. It definitely is an evolving journey. I don't think you're ever done. Something new always pops up.
No kidding. Having the right tools in play to hopefully monitor for all that stuff, I hope, and things like that. No, that's awesome. So I think on the last note here, when we think about, the identity access management piece, SSO, SAML, things of that nature, MFA, just to iterate some of the things we've heard on prior episodes, I think that even though it's obviously, there's a lot of ways to get around it from a threat actor perspective, most of the threat actors that take the time to do that are usually a slightly step ahead of your traditional just cybercrime oriented basics that most of us deal with every day. So I personally iterate how important it is just to start off with MFA as well, and that alone goes towards that ounce of prevention worth a ton of whatever the phrase is. My Texas Marine Corps brain doesn't want me to remember the phrases here, but it is what it is.
I mean, I can fill it in for you. It is a pound of cure, and it was Benjamin Franklin.
Thank you.
That's right.
I would expect someone who lives 5 minutes away from Benjamin
because
Franklin's
I put in a
house
document before this. Otherwise, it's because I put this in a document before you showed up. I had no idea before that. So, but it does make me feel good to make you think I'm a little smarter for once.
Well, I know you're way smarter than me. Otherwise, we wouldn't have this podcast. So it's just how it goes. Yeah. Don't let Elliot sell himself short. He says he's producer, but what he really is chief wrangler, chief intelligence officer, and a bunch of other things right now. So, so I'll tell you what, with that, I'm going to throw it back over to Elliot because I know we're coming up close to time. I know we can go over a little bit, but I just want to go ahead and give it back to Elliot to see if he's got any more curiosity points and see where we go.
I think one of those areas that you had indicated is that you're in a position right now where you sort of get to pave and create a story out of like this cybersecurity system, so to speak. And removing yourself from this particular equation, so you don't actually have to walk through the seat you're in today, but let's say budget was an issue, which obviously we know that will never be a reality, but in a wonderful land with candy that doesn't make us gain weight and all that stuff, if you had unlimited budget and you were trying to build that dream team, I'd love to know from like the person perspective, not even the technology perspective, what are some of those critical hires that you feel are absolutely must that you have to build in to maybe focus on that preventative piece?
Good question. As a security professional, you need to always ask why. So you need to be really curious. And when you get an answer, you have to ask the next question, right? So I think one of the colleagues I work with outside of, it's an outside company that I work with that uses it run to ground. You need to run everything to ground, right? Mm-hmm. And I don't think that's natural for everybody. I think people get an answer and they take it and they're like, okay, got my answer. And so I think that's something that people either have or don't have. And so that's one, I keep calling it a skill set, but it's really just kind of a way of being. And I mentioned people who want to be a constant learner. So curiosity and learning are certainly big. For the kind of roles, if I take the individual people out of it and just say what do we need in people roles in security, I think it kind of depends on what part of security you're in. So if you're doing, I'll just pick on, cloud security, application security, you need a background as a practitioner in that. And I think the reason being is you need to be able to immediately build trust and confidence so that the people that you're working with and, reporting to them on their findings, the findings that you come up with, whether it's based on their code base, if it's an application security, or how they have their infrastructure configured in the cloud. So you're credible, right? You have to have that credibility. So I think those are important. If you're in kind of the governance, risk, and compliance area, you really need to understand who your audience is and what matters to them. I mean, I think you need that in general anyway, just as an IT professional, but if you're, setting policies and running awareness campaigns and, assessing the risk of third parties and all those things that the governance risk and compliance people do, you have to be able to walk in their shoes and understand exactly what it is that they care about, because they don't wake up every morning and care about security. I mean, they may care that the company is secure, right, as a whole. That's a general kind of way of being, but they don't wake up to do it every day. And so you got to kind of latch on to what it is that they do. And then the other pieces of the organization, it's a security function, I call like the security operations piece, the incident response / intel organization. They're not as, I wouldn't call them back office kind of IT folks, or security folks, but they are definitely, running the tools. And they're mostly, security operations in general, they're mostly working with other technologists for the most part. And so having a background in infrastructure or, networking or any of those, I think is really important. Because people it's not as rare now as it was before, but rarely did people come out of college and go right into security. All right, I think that's more happening a little bit more now, because obviously there's actual degrees in cybersecurity and that there weren't before. And so I think people are coming out of school now and going into cyber. And I think that those curriculums have, the ones that we have, University of Texas San Antonio here, UTSA, and they do an awesome job of really well-rounded education for the people that are going through those programs.
I'm going to shout out someone at UTSA, Dr. White. Amazing dude, amazing program. Completely agree. NSA affiliated and accredited program for those listening.
Awesome.
I just have to say, I think you actually ended up answering this in a much better way than I anticipated, which is not trying to drill down into the different aspects of cybersecurity, which obviously you can break that apart in way too many ways, but really looking more at this from like a cultural perspective and like those elements that is like, so Neil and I have a passion for helping people like break into this space. There are somewhat needless barriers of entry for a lot of people, but I think the way that you'd position it is those qualities that are missing. Like on paper, oh, okay, I've got S+, M+, eventually you want to get CISB and all that good stuff. And it's very granular, but like those other elements that you just stated are generally missing. Like, you can't say it's like bedtime manner and all that and conversational, but like, the curiosity elements are generally missing. And if that's the kind of things that people with your stature are looking for, that is so important for people to understand. So I just wanted to point that out, I really appreciate that you share that instead of just the aspects of, oh yeah, clearly you've got to get X, Y, and Z on paper.
Yeah, I think that people who say they want to get into cybersecurity, I always wonder, like, there's so many different roles in cybersecurity and they're very different from each other, right? Just like all IT practitioners are not the same. You've got people that work on apps, people that work on infrastructure, people that work in project management, all different, architecture, right? So I think it's understanding that there's not like a single cybersecurity role, but there's many different ones. And some people will work with their heads down and don't need to talk to people every day. And some people only talk to people every day in that role, so it's really understanding that and gravitating towards, what your skill set is and what your interests are and where your passion is.
Love it. Yeah, that is just fantastic perspective. I think that's just more fuel for that podcast that I know you want to eventually spin off into. But that all said, again, I just want to thank you for joining in and providing your perspective, where we've already monopolized quite a bit of your time. So thank you so much for taking some time again to chat about prevention and just your background. And of course, how you were able to wrangle such a monstrosity of a system with so many different points involved. So again, we just really appreciate you coming in and kind of sharing that perspective with our listeners and occasional viewers.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for joining AZT, an independent series. Your hosts have been Elliot Volkman and Neil Dennis. To learn more about Zero Trust, go to adoptingzerotrust.com, subscribe to our newsletter, or join our Slack community. Viewpoints expressed during the show do not reflect the brands, employers, or companies of our hosts, guests, or potential sponsors.